like to wrap up this series with one final discussion on the EKG. What we know is that this is the P wave, the QRS complex, the T wave. We know the intervals. We know that each one of these is a beat. One thing that I'd just like to emphasize is that a positive deflection on the EKG tracing does not always mean healthy. It depends on what lead you're looking at. So this lead right here on the idealized EKG tends to be lead 2. And that's because lead 2 has a vector force in that direction, and the normal heart has a vector force in the same direction pretty much. So that's going to be your normal tracing. But if your heart had a pathology and had an axis shift more so like that, or even perpendicular, a perpendicular line, so if our lead 2 is in the positive 60, and let's draw that in, and then our other lead was in the negative 30 direction, so exactly perpendicular, our EKG tracing, let's say for the P wave, we'll draw, is going to be biphasic. And when you see a biphasic, either we'll say instead of the P wave, it's going to be a biphasic QRS. If you see a biphasic QRS, you know that, let's say we're looking at lead 2. If we're looking at lead 2 and you see a biphasic QRS, it means that it's perpendicular. It could be perpendicular at the negative 30 degree angle or the opposite. So that's one thing that you do need to consider. It could either be negative 30 or positive 150. So if you see a biphasic lead 2, it could be that. If you see a positive lead 2, you know that it's somewhere between this area. You know that it's somewhere over here. So if you're just given a random QRS complex like that, you know that it's somewhere that way, somewhere that way, somewhere that way. You can't really tell. You'd have to compare the amplitude to another lead, but for the most part, lead 2 will tell you if it's in at least the same plane. Likewise, if you're given a lead 2 and you see a negative QRS, well, what does that actually tell you? Well, it tells you that you have a vector force pointing somewhere opposite of 60 degrees. So you draw on your perpendicular line, you know that it's somewhere between positive 150 and in this up to 130, negative 30. So if you see a negative lead 2, and then you could use that exact same philosophy for everything else. So what's important to remember is it's important to remember the axis that I gave. So you've got your lead 1 is 0, that's lead 1. Lead 2 is positive 60, lead 3 is positive 120, lead AVF is positive 90. Your next one is going to be lead AVL, and that's going to be negative 30. Then negative 150 is going to be AVR. And those are going to be the 6 leads that you're going to look at. So now let's piece together a few leads together at the same time. If you're lead 1 and you're looking at lead AVF, so you're looking at these lead 1 and AVF. If you're looking at lead 1 and F at the same time, it'll give you a good picture of what that normal healthy axis is. If lead 1 QRS complex is positive and lead F QRS complex is positive, you know that it's somewhere between the two, because 1, if this is going to be your vector force, and you draw on that perpendicular line to 1, it's going to be somewhere on this side. Likewise, for F, you know that F faces down this way, so you're going to draw on your perpendicular line, and it's going to be somewhere down here. Well, where do they match up? I mean, so if you know that 1 is positive, meaning it's somewhere over here, and F is positive, meaning it's somewhere over here, you have to be somewhere in this quadrant. You know that your vector force lies somewhere over here, but then a good general rule of thumb, if they're about the same size, if they're equally positive, you know that you just bisect that middle. And let's say one was slightly, I mean, it's still positive, it's just not as positive. You can tell that F is way more positive. It's leaning more towards F. So maybe our vector force is over here now. Because the more close those arrows are together, so if this is the normal heart, this is AVF, the more close they are together, they'll have a higher deflection. So if one is positive and F is positive, but one is way lower than F, you know that your vector force of the normal healthy heart is somewhere over there. And then you can use that philosophy with the others, the augmented and the Einthoven. So for another one, you know that 1 and F are perpendicular to each other. Likewise, you know that 2, lead 2, and AVL are perpendicular to each other. And finally, you know that lead 3 and AVR are perpendicular to each other. So let's draw that. Using any of these combinations, if you look at 1 and F, 2 and L, 3 and R, if you compare those together, then you'll be able to figure out the general direction that the heart is in. So if you have a left axis shift, what that means, you've got 0 and you've got 90, it means that your left ventricle, so if your heart's here, here's your left atrium, here's your left ventricle, right ventricle, a left axis shift would mean that your left ventricle has hypertrophied due to hypertension or any other factors, really. And your net heart movement is going to be off to the side. Anything that brings your normal healthy axis, your heart axis, above 0, so anywhere up here, that's going to be considered a left axis shift. Likewise, if your right ventricle hypertrophies and it brings your and normally you're at about a 45, if it brings your mean axis vector force down above 90, so somewhere over here or over here, that's going to be called a right axis shift. Typically, anything between 0 and 90 or about there is going to be a normal healthy heart. Anything in the upper quadrant is going to be a left axis shift. Anything down in this bottom quadrant is going to be a right axis shift. And using these clinical tools, you'd be able to find out a lot about the heart. You can find out the net vector force, and then if you look further, you can find some pathologies in the EKG tracing. I hope this all helped, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.